Hi everyone, good evening. In a world of ready-mades and digital productions, does craft still have a place in art making? In times where at home has transient meanings, can family trees become allegories of larger cultural meaning? If there is a place called home, then where is it? What color is it? What traditions does it honor? What meanings do they hold? Avid Learning, in partnership with Chemould Prescott Road, welcome you this evening to the walkthrough and discussion, The Incoming Passengers, with artist Desmond Lazaro and art critic and historian Rasna Bhushan. Hi, thank you for being here, all of y'all. Desmond's work reinvents miniature paintings, the tradition he was trained in. His is a boundary-pushing art that makes his tradition craft seem especially current. Born in Leeds in 1968, Desmond came to India in 1990 to study the art at the School of Baroda. There he became obsessed with miniature paintings of Rajasthan and went to train for 12 years in Jaipur under late master painter Bhanuved Sharma. Desmond chose to appropriate a craft that is alien to British art education and to deploy it to describe the world around him. Desmond is also fascinated with themes of house and home as showcased in his latest show, The Incoming Passengers. A wider concern with identity and belonging defines his work that forms part of significant collections, including the International Mumbai Airport. As part of his work, The Way Home, the artist examines house and home as part of wider concern and identity and belonging. Desmond elaborates that sometimes I don't know how to go home, so I constantly define and redefine myself within. Our other speaker today, Rasna Bhushan, is an independent art critic who has written and lectured on prominent contemporary Indian artists and has taught art history at CAVA Mysore, University of Kent, England, the English and Foreign Language University, and the Jawaharlal Nehru Architecture and Fine Arts University, Hyderabad. She has curated significant exhibitions such as Telling Tales in 1997 in England and The Art from India in 1999 in Los Angeles. Thank you both, Desmond and Rasna, for being here today with us. And now we'll take on the presentation that Desmond has for us, where he will express his artistic practice more deeply. Over to you, Desmond.
First of all, thank you for coming. Before we start this whole sort of jamboree, I also want to thank Chemould and my dear Shireen, who's sitting in the back there, and her wonderful team for putting this exhibition together, and more importantly, for having the faith in the work, which Shireen somehow constantly seems to show in me. I hope it's been rewarded in some way. What I'm going to do is really give you a short, brief talk, about the practice of miniature and pitchwhite painting, which is the background to my practice. And then after that, we'll have a talk with Rasna, and we'll have the walkthrough, and then I guess we'll have the questions and answers and Q&A afterwards. So bear with us, and we'll get started. As you know, I trained as a miniature and a pitchwhite painter, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the terms. Pitchwhite means of behind, and they're large cloth hangings that are used in the temple town of Nathdwara in southern Rajasthan. And I was lucky enough to, when I first came to India, I studied at the University of Baroda, and my teacher was Ghulam Sheikh. And Ghulam's wife had studied with Bhanuved Sharma many years before. And I had this penchant for making very large, messy oil paintings of Krishna and Radha. And coming from a Christian background, Ghulam thought that was a bit daft. So he sent me up to Nathdwara and said, why don't you go see large pitchwhites and large miniatures? And I met my teacher, Bhanuved Sharma, then. And the idea was just to go up for a couple of days, spend some time, learn a little bit about the technique, and then leave. It didn't quite work out. 12 years later, I sort of ended up making Jaipur my home. During that period, we made, I spent a good 10 years making temple paintings, pretty much. And that has largely informed my practice. And what I'm going to talk about today is how important that is to the contemporary practice that I try and do today. So this is one of the images. It's almost as big as this wall itself. It's gold leaf on a black dyed indigo cloth, which was done almost 22 years ago, I believe, with the help of 3 others, which one of them was my teacher and his 2 sons. Next slide. This is another one from the same period, taking images from mythology, and we were borrowing heavily on images that we could find from miniature painting history, but then trying to rehash them and revamp them. This is Krishna Govardhan, probably about the same size as this wall here. And this is the Maharas Leela. In the period of 4 years, we made 4 large pitchwise, 3 of them I'm showing now. This is probably the seminal piece, which again tells the story of Krishna and Radha, and the idea that it's based on the 10th book of the Bhagavad Purana, chapter 33, which describes the Ras Leela, which is Krishna's circular dance. And in the story, it's pretty much simple. Krishna basically multiplies himself into multiple beings in order to sport or to dance with the gopis on an autumn full moon night, Sharad Purnima, which is basically shown in the image. And in the temple in Nadadwara, this is hung behind the actual deity of Shunaji, which is an image of Krishna as a childlike form. And the shrine room itself is no bigger. It's about this size, actually, altogether, with a series of steps that go up. And the deity of Shunaji is revealed during a daily darshana, a prayer. And behind that is the pitchwais are actually hung, hence the name pitchwai. But what I want to, I'm sure a lot of you are very aware of the mythology and also the imagery that's associated with miniature and pitchwai. But what I would like to draw a little bit of attention to is the methods and materials. If I were to say that the method is born of the materials rather than the other way around. Today we generally make things, and a lot of artists will make things by other people. They will have studio apprentices, or they will work digitally, and they will have, if they want to make a chair, they will go to a chair maker, and there's lots of different ways of working. When you work within a traditional craft, you're taught that the material will give you the idea for the work, which is an interesting way of entering the whole idea and talking about process, which has largely continued into the work that I do today. So a brief understanding of how a miniature or a pitchwai is made. And whether it's made at a small scale or whether it's made on a vast scale, it's pretty much the same techniques. And there's also a misnomer about the word miniature. It actually doesn't really mean, as we might understand, miniature. It actually refers to the Arabic term called minai, which is the original way in which glazed pottery was actually cured within a fire. And what they would do is they would put on the first glaze lines, the second glaze they would add color, the third layer, so eventually you're building up layers of color by firing the fritware, and it was called overglaze painting. And the term minai is the Arabic word which denotes that, and that eventually became the backbone of what became miniature painting, which largely emulates that particular technique. So here we have generally the idea of how a miniature is done. So if you follow the 6 stages from the drawing, there's the transferring of the image, which is either you can put an image onto the back of an acetate sheet, you can pinprick it, and then you rub pigment on top of the back of it, and you'll end up with a dotted line, which will give you the transfer of the drawing to the actual line itself. Then you color fill, which is the shades of color which are then blocked into certain areas, so you're flattening the whole image. Then you turn it onto its back, and then you burnish the back of it. After you burnish the back of it, the actual surface itself becomes quite light sensitive. So you can then start to slowly wash palettes of color on top of it, which means you can change things very subtly. And then finally you add the old decoration. And so this is what you will see on the surface, but underneath of it, this lot's going on, which is that there's lots of burnishing. Now, the way I can describe it is if, I'm going to shout, it's easier. If you imagine how the color actually works. When you put color onto a surface, what happens when you burnish the color? If you put color on a surface, when you burnish it, basically, the color sits on top of the surface. But when you burnish it, you several things happen. The main thing that happens is that colors are basically forms of light and energy. It's matter, it's moving constantly like anything that happens. And what we do when we heat something is that the color actually, the atoms inside the color, they do this, they line up, and they actually give off light. In other words, instead of being something bouncing around, they actually start to do a very tiny which actually start to behave. And the more they behave, they become more interlinked. The more interlinked they become, the greater they become in terms of reflection. So when you see the idea of a painting which is, it looks as though it's reflecting light, or it looks as though you're creating shadows of light, most of the time, the light is actually within the image itself. What's happening is that it's become so light sensitive, it actually reflects no light. Which is an interesting philosophical fact, because all you're talking about is the idea that there's no light outside ourselves. What happens is that the light is more absorbed, which is why you find in medieval painting there's no three dimensions, everything's like flash. Miniature painting is an example of that. They didn't need the external light source, the light source was within the actual painting itself. If we go to how we colours. So these are the actual colours. And what's the difference between this and what you find in the shop today? Most of the paint that you buy, oils, acrylics or whatever, you're looking at, even in terms of trade agreements, you have to have something like 4% of actual pigment. 4%. The rest of it is industrial binders and fillers. In other words, it's stuff that will make it dry quicker, make it longer lasting, and actually make it every colour the same. So whether you're buying batch number 1 or batch 2001, you get exactly the same colour. Basically, because all these chemicals allow you to be. Even if you were to buy artist quality pigment, it's something like 6% of the actual colour itself. Now this is different from this stuff, which is pure colour. And that all you do is that you grind it, precipitate it, but you don't add anything else to it. The only thing that you will add is gum out of it, which is another natural chemical, a natural substance, in order to produce as a binder. There's no fillers, there's no need to make it last much longer, whatever. It's actually pretty much a natural pigment. So you're taking raw pigment, raw colour, which is either in one stone, could be in one plant, and then you transfer it into another one that transforms. The substance of what I want to talk about is that alchemical change tonight. So basically there are 4 ways of making colour. There's mineral, earth, organic and alchemical. Mineral colour, which are made from rocks and stones, such as, they're known as semi-precious stones. So you have malachite, lapis, typical colours. Then you have the earth pigments, which are the oldest pigments that we know, which are made of soft earth deposits. So you can find them literally inside of the world, certain mountains in the Himalayas. Red, yellow ochre are the oldest colours we know, because they were all the literally soft earth deposits. You pick them up, you grind them, you can use them. Then there's organic colours, which are made from different forms of animal and plant insects, which have to be precipitated into a colour. So such as indigo is a dye. And you precipitate the actual plant, indigo is in, and eventually you'll end up blue, which is the colour. And then there's what we call alchemical colours, which is a different term from chemistry. Alchemical colours is nature's way of cooking your colour, as opposed to a man-made way of doing it. A typical example is the difference between red, which means one thing, vermilion, which means something else, and cinnabar. So if you go back to cinnabar, is actually the rock of which it comes from. When you precipitate that, you then make vermilion, which becomes the colour that we know, which is basically moving and mixing together alchemically. It was first by the Chinese in the 16th century, where you mix mercury and sulfur, and eventually you end up with vermilion. But you start off with cinnabar, the natural rock, nature does that anyway, and it does it for thousands of years. And then eventually from that, you end up with what we now know as modern red. But the original colour of all that was actually cinnabar. And all you would do is you would grind it, precipitate it, so it doesn't change its actual form, it just transforms into another kind of a substance. Excellent. So, traditional pestle and mortar, and we still use this in the studio today. Almost 90% of the colours that I use are natural and handmade. I have people who have been working with me for many years who have taught how to make the colours, as I was, which is largely sitting down with the pestle and mortar, and you grind away. Next slide. So the whites, I've gone through a few colours, not them all, it's not enough time. But basically the whites are something like you'll have, this is natural colour, this is not. And you can see the slight difference between titanium white, top right hand side, and these two, which are the basic colours that people call carrier, which is a very soft earth clay colour, which gives you, instead of being like a DAS white, it's slightly milky, which gives you a slightly different tone of colour. And the difference between traditional colour and the colours that we find today is that the colours that you find today are quite shiny and quite bright. Traditional colour is not, it's quite matte, it's quite dull. It's a different way of understanding how colours work. Next slide. So for instance, this is chemical, this is not. But the different colours, so there's full carrier, Katha carrier, which are the main carriers that we use, which is the soft earth clay, which is actually found mostly just outside of the called Zamania. Otherwise, these are the titanium white and lead white, which are the other colours used in literature. Most of the whites I use are the carriers, the top right-hand side, because it's slightly off white. And to make the colours very simple, pestle and mortar, add a bit of water, grind for about a month. 1 kg will probably take you at least a month to make the actual colour. And all you do every day is that you actually fill the pestle with water. And what happens is that the sediment, because it's quite heavy, will drop to the bottom of the actual pestle and water. Colour, because it's the atoms as I'm talking about, remains as what's known as particles in suspension. In other words, they're bouncing around the colour itself, they don't actually move. And what you have to do is siphon off from that middle section the colour, which is what you're doing here with a simple hose, goes through into a muslin cloth, next slide, and then you end up with the colour itself. Next slide. This is then collected into a tarly plate. You dry it in the sun, you crack it, hence these look like cakes of colour, which is the original term for how colours are made. And then you scrape off the top, and then you jar it with a date. Because each colour will be slightly different. So for instance, in the studio, I've got colours that are going back 10, 15 years, and you tend to work with one painting per jar. You don't change them because it's a slightly different colour every time. You don't get natural, straightforward, same colour all the way. It's always a slight variation. Next slide. So cinnabar, as one example, is a very easy colour to make in terms of it crushes quite easily, and within literally 5 minutes you'll get this. Next slide. But then you grind for a month. Chenilio, the 15th century artist, said that the more you grind it, the greater it gets. Other colours you can grind, you can overgrind them, you can grind the colour out of them. Cinnabar is the opposite. You know, within about 2 months, you'll get something along these lines, which you then filter, and then you get the fine colour itself. This is Sindor, which is the colour that's made alchemically. Basically, you roast lead to 650 degrees. And then the actual lead itself gives you a rust colour on top, like you normally find with rust. You collect that, and that gives you this colour. And the difference with this one is that because it's chemically based in lead, when you grind the colour, at the bottom of here you'll see that the flurry of the scum at the bottom is the actual sediment. You collect the colour, what happens is the flurry, the sediment goes to the bottom, the flurry goes to the top, which is kind of the scum, this kind of stuff here. This gets spooned off and the colour remains inside here. Once you precipitate those and move them, then you've got gopher. So to make a colour, all you do is you mix gamma arabic, which is from most of the gamma arabic in India that's used for painting cosmetic. It's a very fine form of colour in that the crystals are almost whitish. The more cloudy they are, the more trouble you're going to have with it. And because it's quite clear, you just add that into the pigment, and then you're ready to go. And once you make a pigment, you can keep it for, in the studio, normally I have quite big bowls of colour, and some of them I've had for like 15 years. Because, you know, you just leave it, it dries out, and then you put some water stuff again. Which is, saves a lot of money from buying colours, because I don't. Indigo is one particular colour. I mean, the major colours that were used as a part of the miniature, the pitch white was azurite, which is always found with malachite, lapis, or indigo. Next slide. So this is lapis, this is azurite. Lapis comes in different forms. There's ultramarine ash, Basically, if you grind lacquers, the first grind gives you what's called an ash color, which is a cloudy kind of a blue color. So in the Tibetan tradition, they would use that for the sky. And the way that you grind the color, you will get different colors at different stages. So the first color is a cloudy color, which is used for the sky. Then you grind a bit normal, you put some milk into it, you grind more, you get a deeper kind of blue, until eventually you come to the face of Krishna, which is a very dark ultramarine blue, which is the same that was used for the Virgin Mary, except used for most tanka paintings. And depending on the quality and the skill of the grinding and how you make it, then the colour just slowly gets, I mean, from 1 kg of lapis, you'll probably end up with 15 grams, if you're lucky, of pure ultramarine. But the rest of it doesn't get thrown away, it just goes to different parts of the painting. So if you ever look at old pitch writing, you see the sky, which is that scalloped kind of a shape. Basically, it's a mixture of this with white. So the colours are not wasted, every bit is used, which is in different ways. So this is indigo tinctorial, which is the main indigo that's found and still harvested in South India. This is basically, next slide, no, go back. There's a vat. It's almost like a big tando that's placed into the ground. You put the actual indigo tint into it. You put a pH balance, which is normally an alkaline solution, to starch, and it's fermented. And as it ferments, it gives up a kind of a flurry, which is a little scum on top. You collect the scum, and then you get in touch with cakes. Then that comes into the studio, then we grind it, and you'll end up with quite a decent kind of a blue. So this painting, for instance, was made with the indigo blue. Same. Next slide. So we come to the work that I do today. So the making of this particular work, this is how it was done, which is the movement and the bringing together of two different things, gold and blue. And traditionally these have always meant specific things within the Christian and the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition, which is they both mean infinity. And the idea that you would always find Krishna would have yellow and blue, because the yellow represents the earth and the blue represents the sky, because the idea of the finite and the infinite were brought together in one being, one consciousness. And I've always been fascinated with that. So in this particular work was where I took the image of the Maharaj Leela, which is the story of Krishna's circular dance, and I translated it into the original text. And what I'm illustrating is the technique of how you use the gold leafing, which is this thing called a raised gill. And a note on that, in the Indian tradition, most of the Tanjore paintings that we know, most of the Indian traditions, miniatures they use gold paint. And to make gold paint, you take 10 leaves into a tali dish, you put some gold paint, and then you rub it to the side of your hand. And it's a precipitation of the heat of the hand that makes the actual colour. It's a very special way of doing it. You can't do it with your finger. It's only this part of the hand, because you waste less, actually. And when you're dealing with gold, you have to do. So from gold leaf, which is basically, you get a small, there's a mangle machine that you'll find even in Jaipur today. You basically put a little keg of gold, which is probably a couple of microns thin. You put it through the mangle, and it comes out as a strip. They cut the strip is fed into a small booklet, which is made of calfskin. Each page will have a little square of this gold leaf. Then they'll have the calfskin, then another one. And they'll beat it. And you can enjoy it, you still get the beat. And eventually it spreads out the leaf and you get the gold leaf. Then you set the gold leaf, put it into a tally plate, beat it to gold paint. So most of the miniatures and the pitchwise use gold paint. Then there's gold leaf itself, where you put the leaf directly onto the cloth. That's another technique. This is another one, and then in the Indian tradition, what they did later on is that when they wanted to elaborate large areas in gold paint, and they couldn't have enough money to make those areas because it's so expensive, they would actually mix ceramic powder, which came from, again, from chemistry, from the pottery industry. They would mix it with white powder and yellow powder, and they would make them a paste, a putty. And this would harden quite quickly. And then on top of that, you put a bit of varnish, and then you put the gold leaf. Now the difference between that and the Western technique is that once you put the gold on top, it stays there and you can't touch it. The minute you touch it and scratch it, it will come off. So what they used to do in the Tanjore technique is that they would put lots of varnish on top to protect it. So that's why you tend to find in South Indian paintings, specifically at the Mysore school, it tends to be quite heavy, these images. It's, the gold becomes really, really thick. In the Western technique, they're a bit more, These are different ones. It's called a recipe that was given by an amazing artist from the 15th century called Chemould. And he wrote a book which basically became the handmaid's book of how to make oil paint. And in it, he describes a recipe where you mix molasses, which is sugar, lead white, sulfur dihydrate, and medium bulk, which is a kind of clay. And you mix that together and you make what's called a raised gesso gill, which takes quite a little time to get it right. Basically, the molasses is a sugar which absorbs any kind of pigment that's put on top of it. The sulfur dihydrate is like a plaster, so it hardens like dental plaster, really quick. So basically, what you can do with that is you can create shapes like this. This hardens very quickly. As soon as it's hardened, you breathe on it, and it's the warmth of your breath which heats up the top surface, and in a few seconds you can put gold leaf on, and it absorbs into the actual clay itself. Now these were used for the carpet pages of Bibles. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first letter, the J would be gilded, or the B would be gilded. And the idea of using your breath, which is prana, the idea that it's life breath, would enhance the actual surface, and then you would gild on top of it. Now the trick is that once that happens, you can then burnish it. And you can burnish it means that you can create very subtle gradations of colour and gradations of gold. So it doesn't appear sort of stark. You can use red gold, which gives you one kind of colour, yellow gold another one, and you can play with how much you want to burnish it. Will give you what kind of work that you're doing. In other words, the tangier technique is quite limited. The one that was used in Italy is much more versatile. You can play with it. I'll show you examples of it again. Next slide. As well as methods and materials, what's also interesting about the idea of pitchroy is that behind most traditional crafts, whether it be temple making, Qurans, any form of what we call sacred art, there is what we call the geometry. And the geometry is almost like a hidden amalgamation of square, circle, triangle, which is a Pythagorean idea, but it's also very much a Vedic idea. And the principle is that within the tangible shapes, you define space itself. And if you understand the idea of geometry, it gives a subtle harmony. And the idea within the temporal space is that by using sacred geometry, you will call down the idea of timelessness. You enshrine it within time. Fundamentally, that's what Christian churches are about, it's what temples are about, it's what mosques are about. The idea that you create heaven on earth, a space which is of the timeless, by using certain, you could call it yantras, it's the same idea, which is either the seed syllable, which is the tantra, yantra, and mantra. So the mantra is the sound, tantric is the form, and yantra is one way of doing there. And this is largely informs how miniatures are made. And this is just one example of how a construction of a pitchroy is made. There are two incommensurable forms, a square and a circle, and they do not combine. One means heaven, one means earth. But mathematically, you can actually combine them. Pythagoras worked it out. So basically, if you look at the outer circle here, there's a square. If I was to draw a line through the middle of this thing and tangent these areas here, here, and here, and then draw circles, what happens is that it's very simple. You just draw a square here, a line here, and you diagram from here to here. This means that this main circle in here tangents 5 times along this axis, which is a musical fifth. It's precise. It's absolutely spot on. So in other words, you square the circle and the square become area and parameter is exactly the same. Now what that gives you is a basic measurement. As you can see, the image goes through his heart. Next slide. So if you go to that main circle there, which is that one, you divide the circle once, then again, then again, and again. You end up with this small circle here, which passes through Krishna's heart. If you then count it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the chakras. So in other words, the idea is that you start at the outside of an image, you work to the inside of the image. And it's, again, you're moving from heaven to earth, back again. Next time. This piece of work called the Rasna Bhushan, where I decided a couple of years ago to take the story of the Maharashtra, which is largely neglected. We don't know much about the story anymore. We know a lot about the image. You can go to most craftsmen in Rajasthan and you can say, can you make me a rasna? And they'll do it blindfolded. But if you ask them, can you elaborate a little bit more about the story? It's gone. Nobody reads the Sanskrit text anymore. So I decided that I wanted to actually figure out what that text was. So luckily a friend of mine is a Sanskrit scholar and speaks perfect Hindi and English. So we spent 6 months learning the poem, and he explained every line from chapter 33, which Chris has put down. And I wanted to see whether I could recreate that as a raised gilt, which is normally used for carpet pages, but on a much larger scale. Next slide. This is what we came up with. So basically I took the main circle of the original painting, which became the square of the actual text in chapter 33 itself. It's a contemporary version of basically a very old myth, which draws attention to the idea of the story rather than the image itself, because we've lost the story. And, next slide, which is finally the work in the studio, which is another work that came after that, the one you're seeing here. And the idea of story really became the background of the exhibition you're seeing here. And it started off with my mum. I asked her one day, what was it like leaving Burma and arriving in England?
Can you please use the mic because
Sorry.
it's not getting recorded anymore.
Hello. Yeah. This painting, which is the Ras Leela story, I remember one day having a very brief conversation, as you do, between a mother and a son, about my mum arriving in England, and I wanted her to tell her story about what it was like to arrive. I was kind of fascinated. What was it like when you got off the boat? Was it cold? What did people look like? And I was kind of interested in this idea of how you collect stories. And now that today, most of the stories that we have get lost. And I was kind of interested to hear what her story was. And that largely began the body of work that you see in front of you. But what I was lucky enough to do was to take this understanding, which had taken me 20 years to get round, into that story, which became the background of the work that you're about to see this evening. Thanks. So, after I asked my mum about this idea of what it was like to move from England to Burma, I decided that I wanted to try and see if I could find my roots. My wife is French. I've lived in India for 20 odd years, which is half my adult life. And at some stage, I kind of got to stay here, so I was looking for a way of somehow extending my stay, as it were. And there was a thing called the PIA, a person of Indian origin, arrived with a kind of visa, and I thought, well, I should see if I could find some kind of evidence of this. And my dad said to me, oh, you know, your great-grandfather came from Chennai or Madras and blah, blah, blah. So one day I decided, well, why don't I see if I can find it? And he said to me, there's a church called St. Mary's Catholic Church in Chennai, and you might be able to see if you can find an old family record. So I went to the church with my son one day, and I left a message with this very sweet Jesuit priest who said to me, oh, I'll get back to you. And I sort of left thinking nothing was going to happen. And then about a month later, he called me and said, oh, by the way, we might have found something, which is an old register, and in the register, which is from 1855, was the basically birth record of my great-grandfather. And when you grow up in England, and you spend most of your life travelling and living somewhere else, knowing that that somewhere else is kind of your spiritual home in a way, and then you find evidence of the history of that, something happens, it becomes quite visceral, it becomes real. It's no longer mythology. Suddenly you find an ancestor who leaves a mark on a piece of paper which is a part of your life. And I was fascinated by this book. And so the baptism certificate is basically the page, and the top page reads a man called Peter Felix Lazaro, who was my great-great-grandfather. And the interesting thing is that my middle name is Peter, and his name is Peter. My middle son was called Felix, and he's actually called Felix. Although we didn't know this at the time. And I wanted to pay homage to the words of a scribe who I do not know, I will never have a conversation with, and yet within the marks of these pieces of paper, was history, and it was real, it was my history, and I wanted to pay homage to that. So this is where this work called the Baptism Certificate began. And the couch at the bottom was taken, when I called this gentleman from this priest, we just had this torrential storm in Pondicherry where I live, and I'd done a lot of work on traditional houses, small little shacks, which you found dotted around the Coromandel coast. And when the storm came, a lot of people put their old furniture out to sort of dry in the sun. And I remember walking down the street and somebody left this old chair in the middle of the street. And I think so much of life in the UK and life in Northern Europe comes down to watching television and sitting on a couch. And I thought it would be interesting to bring these two sort of symbols together, abandoned objects from different times and different periods, and see what would happen if they sit on the same page. So that's the baptism certificate. On the right, we can turn this way, and I'll move to the back. This is a work which is a reproduction of the entire sentence itself. So it describes when he was born, where he was born, 10th of May 1855, 21st of May. Then I realised that with this and a few other works that I kind of had the beginnings of what would become the body of what we now call the incoming passages. And this became the first of that volume, which was fundamentally the baptism certificate, finding my great-grandfather. And then it led to a sort of question, because I wanted to know what did he look like? I mean, was he tall? Was he dark? Did he have black hair? I mean, what did he look like? And the thing was, from 1855, there's not much photographic evidence of India. The Photographic Society of Madras didn't start until about 1860, by the time it took off. And before that, there were scant photographs, and most of those were for the Archaeological Survey of India, what became that. So there's very little in terms of the imagery of what Madras would look like. So I was kind of faced with a conundrum, is how do you paint a portrait of somebody you can't see? How do you understand a history that you can't actually touch? And what is that history? Because it's real and it's physical, I can see it in front of me, but I can't actually tangibly touch it. So I began to look at the history of Chennai and look at the town itself and wandered around, spent a lot of time looking at different archives, and realised that Chennai was a very important place in terms of the empire, in terms of colonialism. Mainly because it was the main trade route of Chennai was built in order so that people could get to China. And it was used as the main trading station port, of which you could then trade throughout the whole of not only the Coromandel coast, but right the way throughout Southeast Asia. Pepper, spices, Kochi, the whole lot. You either went to Kochi or you came to Chennai. And then from Chennai, you refueled, and then you went out to the Malacca Straits. And eventually you tried to get to China, because that was the golden goose back then, was to get there in order to establish trade routes. Hence we have the Opium Wars, etc. And I was fascinated by this, and fascinated by the fact that many chettiars were taken by the British later on throughout Southeast Asia. So they went to Burma, they went to Singapore, they went to Hong Kong, and they were used as accountants, and they were used as engineers. And all my great-grandfathers were engineers. So then I began to think, well, that means as multinationals, because that's what the East India Company was, it was the first conglomerate. As these things move and merge, in order to establish trade, as the trade went and moved, so did people. And inherently, this is how most of Southeast Asia and our world today was actually the globalization that we understand began with that, the movement of people, settling from one part of the world to another. So then I find my family now, the next generation is in Burma. So from this now, we come two generations and we're now in Rangoon. And they've been moved as a part of this colonial flotsam and jetsam. And then eventually, at the end of civil war in Burma in 1957, because my parents and grandparents were part of the British fraternity in terms of building railways and they worked for Brits, they were kind of given a choice, either leave or you become second-class citizens. They were known as Anglos, and you'll find lots of Anglos who lived along the Coromandel coast. You'll find them even in Mysore, Bangalore, Goa. And my parents were part of the Anglo community. And when Civil War came to Burma, they were given a choice. They would get out or stay and you become second-class citizens. But that means you no longer go to good schools. So my grandfather, within the period of literally a month, had to make a decision. Do I leave? Do I go? And the film that my mum, and I hope you'll get a chance to see it, she basically talks about the idea of, you know, they just had to leave. And then I'm sort of fascinated about this whole idea of this, how did they get to it and what was it like? Which brought me to this series of work, which is the title, as it says, Passengers. I was lucky enough to find the actual records of their journey. And what was fascinating about it is that the ship that they went on was called the SS Salween. It's a 7,066-ton ship that was used during the war to convey passengers as well as goods and services throughout the Second World War. It eventually, at the last part of its life, became the main ship that moved between Southampton, Liverpool, and Rangoon. And there's some amazing stuff going on there. So Rangoon, before 1936, had more immigration in New York than New York. It had the 50% of the actual population of Burma was Indian. If you go to Rangoon today, there's nothing but actually Indian architecture all over Rangoon itself. So there's been a movement of people, of which my family was a part of it. And I managed to track down and find the actual certificates. What had happened was that what I found in the period from 56 up until 62, my mum and her family, my father on his own, my grandfather, my brothers, my dad's two brothers, and my grandmother all went to the same ship. And no one knew about this. Hence the reason I became obsessed with the idea of the Salween. So the painting at the back is a reproduction of the actual ship itself, which I found in those records. And these are the records. So here you find my great-grandfather, Vincent, and my dad's two brothers, Patrick and Clarence. And this is my dad, Desmond, Anthony, and that was the day that we sold. And again, it was about trying to pay homage to a very mundane passenger list, in the same way that the baptism certificate is a mundane list. But within these mundane lists of our lives, they're not mundane. If you look closely, they're much more than that. In the same way that the stories that our parents tell us and our grandparents, they're not just stories. If we actually listen to them, they're quite interesting. So this became this body of work. So the video information is me talking to my mum. She lives in Australia. And I just had a quick 10-minute conversation with her, which began this first body of work called The Incoming Passengers. Come further on, we'll go to the next bit. You can see the film when we have some time. If you can gather over here, as I said, so I'd come to The Incoming Passengers. So I called it part one, because it felt like it was part one of a story. And then, when my dad kind of got jealous, because I was sort of talking to him about her story, and he kept on telling me his story. So one day he said to me, "Oh, I've got these old films, do you want them?" And basically he gave me a carrier bag, and there were 12 8mm cine films, the reels, that he took when we were children. And he said, "Oh, do you want to have a look at these?" And so I got them digitized and I started to look at them, and they became a really fascinating story of me and my siblings growing up in England. And what was interesting is that my dad's a plumber. He's a typical sort of craftsman. He works with his hands. And he always had this penchant for really high-tech gadgets. So back in the 60s, he had this really high-tech camera which was colour, which would have been unheard of at the time. So he gave me these 12 cine films. And this is the body of work which is called cine film. And I basically translated them digitally. And then I took specific stills from the film and I turned them into Polaroid formats. And I returned to my bases of interest. And this is the series that we see here. So there's actually 60 altogether. There's only 11 on display. The rest are put shown on this here. But basically it comes down to 3 or 4 bodies of work which make up the same story. This is my grandmother, my dad's brother George. This is the street that I grew up in Leeds. And this is my sister's first Holy Communion. This was, it's called Mom's Roses because my mom, she had these plastic roses that she kept on the kitchen table. And like most immigrants, she never actually went out and bought fresh roses. She bought like one, and then she cleaned it every day, religiously. And then my dad was given this piano, and being a craftsman, he didn't see the point of the piano, so he turned it into a chair. and that's what immigrants do. We borrow, we steal, we make lives out of thin air. And that's what it seemed like growing up. So the only reference we had to England was, to Burma, was this calendar that was kept in the living room, which was from 1971. We just stayed on that page for most of my childhood, and it was the image of the Sweden Pagoda, which is the most monumental image in Rangoon itself. And then, of course, there was the obligatory trip to see the Queen. So your parents take you to Buckingham Palace, and then you stand outside and you meet the Queen, who's long since gone. And so this is the Victoria Memorial. The interesting thing about the memorial is there's only two of them. One is outside Buckingham Palace, the other one is in Calcutta. And above it is this winged angel. And what happened with because my dad was a terrible cameraman, he overexposed everything, and it was always blurred, so you got these kind of strange images of me and Mum walking on top of Victoria's head down the stairs, or my brother sort of looking as if he's playing with the Coldstream Guards at Buckingham Palace. The other images of me as a chubby kid at Mabel's dog pretending that it's Saint-Tropez, believing it wasn't, it was freezing. The caravan park that we went to and played in, the merry-go-round that we played on. And they're kind of funny, because it's like, okay, Joyce arrives in England in 57, and then what happens 10 years later? Well, this happens. And this happens is your life. It's the little snaps, the vignettes of childhood, but I think they're also really important, because important in that, not because they're painted or anything, but just they capture memories in a way that photographs and images do, but then the image is turned back into a painting, which has a whole different meaning within that itself. And they're an interesting sort of artifact, again, of what it was like in terms of immigration, what it was like to grow up in, what it felt like. You know, the fact that Maplethorpe was just miserable. But we went there every year because that's what we did. We went to see the Queen because that's what we did. We went to church on Sunday because that's what we did. And it was kind of a celebration, and I've always felt really fond of that. So this became In Company Passengers 2. And as I was making this module the last couple of years, and I've spent some time in the Middle East, I used to teach at the University of Jordan, Al-Baqqa. And so I knew, in fact, I was teaching there during the Second Gulf War. And that had a hell of an effect on me because I remember teaching with a carpet designer called Usta Chalabi. And Saddam had attacked. The Americans had moved in. And virtually all the staff just disappeared overnight. And they thought there would be this massive exodus into Jordan, into Amman from Baghdad. But actually it was the opposite. Everybody went back to Baghdad because they welcomed the Americans and they wanted Saddam out, they wanted to rebuild Iraq. And I remember being there in the middle of all, just being completely confused. And then, as I was making this work, I was kind of celebrating my mum's journey as a girl. Now, she says in the story, she puked for the first week, so the ship's captain just let her eat ice cream for the next 2 weeks, and her sister. So it's this nice, pleasant sort of journey arriving in England, and then it's really good fun. And then you see on the TV that this is not happening now. There's another story to immigration. And it's an extension of the story that's been going on for the past 400 years. It's just that now we're actually drawing attention to it because kids are dying. 500 people died this week in the Med. And the Suez, SSL wing went through the Suez, it went through exactly the same problem. You go through Aden and you end up in the Mediterranean. And as that was going on, I thought, I can't really ignore this. It's just too much in my face, and I have to respond to it somehow. So this work here, which is called Crossing the Med, is based on 9 Seuss, painting from the 16th century, where I reimagined a miniature painting. I'd been in Switzerland a couple of years earlier, and I saw this amazing painting by Madame, who was 9 Seuss father and 9 Seuss. And what was interesting about it is that it's a huge piece of paper, which for a miniature is unheard of. The fact that they made a really big painting, and it's very sparse, it's just water and then a ship. And the myth is that the people on the ship are sort of caught between a fiery ledge, or one side, at the top there's like the village is on fire, so everybody jumps into the boat, and then they take off to go to the other side of the Ganges, then there's a storm, and they get stuck. And you don't know whether in the myth whether they're going forwards, backwards, up or down, they're just stuck. And I thought it was really interesting as a metaphor for what's happening today, because these gentlemen and these people who are going north, they're going to an imaginary homeland that actually doesn't exist. It's about this will to go north. My parents had a will to go north. We still have this idea of looking to the west as some other way, but actually, what is the myth? We're stuck. We're still stuck in that. And I want to reimagine that image. And again, I go back to my training as a military in order to help me to arrive at that. And I love the idea of revisiting older paintings, because the original is profound. Because there's two paintings that he made at that time. One was the ship called Crossing the Ganga. Another one was, it's a mountain, and it's just basically, imagine an image like a square. There's a big mountain, a few trees, and nothing. And all you can hear is the sound of the wind rustling through the Himalayas. And what he's talking, and there's no figures, there's no narrative, there's no story, there's no myth. But what he's doing is actually talking about landscape painting 300 years before the European tradition. Because he's just out there, and it's freezing cold, and he sees this mountain, and it's cold, and he just goes back and paints it. And it's a really profound bit of work, in the same way that he's reimagining this story of this boat, and we don't know where the people are going, they're just stuck. And I've always been interested in, this became the basis of what this work was here. The last one, I say it's the last, it's a part of the same book, which is sort of returned to pitchwhite, and sort of reimagined taking the idea of using the pitchwhite format in a more contemporary way. And normally pitchwhites, they have the red, the cinnabar, they have a border called the Hindu border. And most Rajasthani images have that very famous red border at the back. And pitchwhites are the same, they also have these red borders. And I wanted to work with that somehow. And so I took two images. One was the image of my mum before she left Burma, myself and my siblings, outside our house in Leeds, on my sister's confirmation. And when I was in Chennai, I was looking at these records from my great-grandfather. At the back of the book was a series of these small little bits of paper, which were declarations. And these are from the 1820s onwards, and there's hundreds of them. And as I opened the book, they all kind of fell on the floor, and basically they all said the same thing, which is the words here. And the idea is that if you're going to marry somebody who's non-Christian, you are allowed to marry them as long as you promise that your children will always be brought up in the Catholic faith. So it was kind of a declaration of faith. It was something that you had to do. And the interesting thing is that, they moved from Burma as a Catholic family. They were now in the 70s England. And my sister is holding a small piece of paper on her confirmation, which is pretty much the same idea that she becomes the bride of Christ for one day. In other words, the article of faith continues. So even though we move north, and the image on the back is taken from an old map, again, a symbol of going north. And I'm kind of interested in the whole idea of how history is really about layers. It's never from one fixed point. Which brings me back to the nature of miniature painting. It's miniature paintings. There's not, as I said before, there's not one shaft of light. It's multiple lights, because the light comes from within the image. There's no perspective, because there's a tiger, and then a tiger, and then somebody fighting the tiger, and somebody sleeping on the elephant. In other words, there's multiple viewpoints within one. So the story unfolds as you move around the image. Time is not linear. It's cyclic. One story connects to another story, and then that story connects to another story. And I think immigration is largely about that, and it's stories within stories within stories. The narrative that we are being told is bullshit. It really is. It's a lie, it's a construct. And I wanted to talk about that, because I think my mum's story is a story, and we all have them. Thanks. Rasna.
Right, actually, as the story went on beautifully, Desmond, just by the way, I think it had its own kind of impulse while you were actually narrating it. But I want to kind of start where you left off at your slide projection and bring it right up to this moment where you left off here. You ended with talking about the story. That is the story, the Bhagavad Purana, which you actually wanted to script in to the diary, right? And to fit what is basically calligraphic and verbal, linguistic, you know, to fit that into the scheme of the picture frame, into the scheme of the philosophical kind of framework. And I thought that was amazingly done in terms of the way, I don't know, you have to tell me, did you actually choose part of it, or was that the whole?
No, the sound and the story was told to me by a friend of mine in Pondicherry. But I worked with another friend who's a calligrapher, Danish Jade, and we talked about it for months how we'll do this. And the difficulty is that once you start here with Sanskrit, you can't judge to get the square down there exact. So he tried for months drawing it, and then one day he kind of cracked it. And it's something that we just got to start to get the spacing exactly right. And I said to him, I basically want this text as a square. And he said, no, it's impossible, it's never going to work. You should always end up with a gap, or it would stop halfway through. But after many, many attempts, he managed to nail it. And then I took his calligraphy and I tried to stay as accurate as I could to the original script that he'd done, and with gilding.
Yeah. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that you said that the Pichwai painters will paint you the Maharasi, like that, but they don't know the story. So you write the story into the image, right? Literally write it in.
Yeah.
It's a script, it's written in a script. And yet, this is what I want to talk about, because, what is the story, really? Does the story lie in the telling of it, or the writing of it? Or is there a story? Are there many stories? And I'm sure that you will say there's more than one story, or multiple stories, etc. What I'm interested in is, when you speak about the work, it is a narrative, it is a story, and there's so many stories behind each work, or each image, or memory, or, event, etc. And yet, what I find quite fascinating, especially in that lot about there, is that you actually take documents. They are written records. And the whole purpose of writing them out is that they're meant to be read. And they're just, it's information. There's no narrative, it is information, in a sense, So they're numbered, the person, the name, the age, where they came from, where they're going, is it a birth certificate, is it a marriage certificate, is it a death certificate? Now these are certificates, they are documents, they're put down in a certain way, they're numbered, etc. Now you take what is actually typewritten, some of these were typewritten.
Most of them, these ones for sure.
Yeah, so they were typewritten, which is a mechanical kind of process. And you take that document, you actually take the same type. You don't change the type.
No.
Place. You don't change the way it is spaced in type, by a specific type like as keys. You take that and you rewrite by hand. A very laborious process. And you enlarge it. And some of them you add little images like this. Right? So again, what I'm trying to get at is that there's this kind of twinning of the story, one in terms of records and documents, and then reading between the lines of those and creating the stories with memories. You're fleshing them out with memory, whether it's with family history, family memories, or the larger kind of, narratives that we have. So, what I realize is there's a kind of a dual thing going on. Is one, there is a need to have the story and to keep repeating it and keep think you work between these two. You're very interested in archival information, in records.
Well, I think we're living at a time of the digital age and how information and data is collected in such an impersonal way, and yet it affects all our lives. We all have a mobile phone in our pocket right now. As soon as this is finished, most people will switch that on and check their mail. It's the first thing you do in the morning, the last thing you do at night. And so our transference of information is through certain modes which are outside of ourselves. And the idea of reproducing a typed letter is that you steal it back and you bring it back to the personal, which is a kind of a way of working with miniature, in that miniatures were never meant to be seen on walls. They were meant to be handheld. In other words, you physically bring this object into your personal space and you live with it, and you wander around the image and you stay with it, which is diametrically the opposite of what's happening in terms of modernism, which is to take that small thing and then you just explode it. And it's the explosion of it and the interest of what happens when you explode it that becomes an narrative that we have today. And I love the idea that you can almost like push it back in, and you push it back into that space, and it's the pushing into that space which requires a hand, and a heart, and time. And these are things that we're moving more and more away from. And I wanted to take a mundane list and reproduce it as an object, trying to make it kind of beautiful. And that journey from one to the other is really kind of, for me, really important, because in the process of doing that, you're reclaiming the history. You're also making it up. You're also opening history to another layer of interpretation. But I like the idea that none of these images were reproduced as photographs. I painted. I could just blow up the image of the South Wing and just get my frame done. But it's the business of actually taking it on as a minute entity, as a thing in itself. And I feel as though sometimes you're stealing it back. And so much painting today, we don't do that. And I think sometimes we need to kind of do that, because then the narrative takes another level, another meaning. And I'm interested in that a lot.
Yeah, related to this is the idea of line.
Yeah.
The line is the first central to script.
Right.
I mean, every alphabet in any language is kind of delineated by line, which is written out. And in miniature painting and in your painting here, the line, of course, is central. Everything is drawn rather than painted.
Yeah.
In a sense, what we were talking about earlier, with oil painting, what happens is that you have areas of color, and even in a very naturalistic oil painting normally is of a larger scale. When you go very close, what happens is that any object breaks up into color areas. And
Pixelates. It pixelates.
It pixelates. Yeah. Whereas if any of you go close to these larger paintings, like the one Bishop or those, you can go as close as you want. You can take that magnifying glass that's kept there and look really closely, and you will still find that there is no breaking up into color areas. There's no pixelation. It still is line. I mean, waves of water, all of that is still line, however close you go. And something else that I thought, what is this relationship of line in a painting, painting it with lines, and writing? Because in your work, there's a lot of interrelationship between script and image. And then I will go back to what you did with the script and the habit.
I think I've always had this idea, I've always been fascinated with this idea that you can, if you're working as a miniaturist and you're working with making small works, when I blow that up to a museum kind of a scale or a gallery scale, I still want to keep the intensity of it. Just because it gets bigger, you still should have that need to allow that intensity to slowly spread, rather than it jump to something else. Because then I'm interested in the idea of the juxtaposition, the dichotomy between the two. which is the self and the other. Because what we found when I was looking at all this work with my mum is that there are moments in history where personal narrative and collective narrative and history narrative collide in moments. And sometimes these moments are documents, sometimes these moments are a photograph, sometimes these moments are a song or something that's passed on. But that moment in history where things kind of they line up in one way, and where the intensity is carried through many different levels. And as a painter, I'm kind of interested in that in terms of whether I'm working on a large scale or a small scale, that need with the line to transfer it to a larger scale, but don't lose any of the intensity of the small. I kind of like that dialogue between the method and the material, what you're making, how you're making it.
Yeah, that's really obvious because even with, like painting out a type of sheet, for instance, or painting out what was actually film. So you're kind of reversing the process.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So.
And I keep going back to that of stealing it back, because that doesn't very much like a thief. That's all I do, is steal stuff back towards paint, because paint is my language, the painter. And I think that way, I think in terms of what colour does when it goes with there. And that's I'm a firm believer in that somehow. But at the same time, I'm also interested in pushing it at the same time. Where does the paint actually take you? Where does the image actually take you? Where does the body of work take you?
Well, that happens with the cosmic egg as well. Because, a front print is usually a print. It's like a stamp.
Sure, that's it.
And you take that stamp, you take the print away from reproduction and actually make it again, enlarge it. And it takes on a completely different presence.
It was a funny painting now because I made the plot, I dyed it, and got it ready, and had this blue thing sat in the studio for about a year, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do on it. And there's a tradition in miniature painting where you do these small spirals with a brush, and you start, they're almost about the size of your thumb pretty much, and you start on the edge and you go to the centre of the circle. And it's a breath control thing, and you kind of learn that in order to understand how the brush moves. And so I was thinking about doing something with spirals and then the hand and how would that work and how we're going to do a video of it, etc. And eventually, you start to look at your own hands and how they're made and the spirals within that. But at the same time, I was also into the idea of the shape of the cosmic egg. I like the idea of the parallels running within the two. And this, but at the same time, the thumbprint was introduced by the British, nobody else, in order to discern things. And on the one hand, we see it as identity, but actually what it does is the opposite. It makes it all the same, because one print looks like another one. And it dehumanizes as much as it becomes a form of individual identity. It actually does diametrically the opposite. It turns everybody into a print, which is, today it's a really interesting thing, in terms of data and information flow and the way that we live our lives. We're constantly trying to negotiate the space between the collective and the individual. And I think the thumbprint kind of sums that up, because on the one hand it's very open, it's a thumbprint. On the other hand, it's completely dehumanized.
Well, I'd say it contains both simultaneously.
Yeah.
Because it cannot be completely dehumanized. So it cannot be completely dehumanized by the mere fact that it is produced by a part of the human body.
Yeah.
Literally a reproduction of the human body.
That's what I find interesting.
Yeah. So it is a kind of a paradox.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time I'm interested in those paradoxes.
Yeah. Well, we now have biometric things of the eye, right?
And it's becoming more and more.
Yeah.
Your phone will have thumbprint and it envisages a whole conversation that we could go on all night about. But I'm interested in the dichotomy and the contradiction between two things. Because I think within that space is something interesting.
Yeah, you keep alluding to that in many of the things that you've written. For instance, you often use the words inward outward, abstract, real, imaginary. And these are always, as we know, they're not opposites. They're actually really symbiotically related all the time. Opposites aren't really opposites.
No.
They are kind of mirror reflections of each other, in a sense. So, I want to bring that, which is a more kind of formal exercise, somewhere is very important to the whole idea of abstract art and figurative art. But I would question that because there is this kind of common notion that abstract art is something coming from the artist's mind, imagination, etc., etc. But we have, of course, examples of Cézanne, we have, all the great early moderns, for instance, whose abstraction came from very specific, solid physical reality, whether they be apples or mountains, even Mondrian's, whole kind of lines and clips and things came out of that. So just as a topic of, something to think about, because I know you're preoccupied with that idea of the tensions between two inward things, which is your memory, interest in people's lives, memories, histories, and then they having to be supported by something that's physical, outside, outward, like documents, data, etc., etc. Right? So, would it be all right to kind of beg these things?
No, I think it's a good way. I like the idea of tension between things. I'm English, I live in England, my wife's French. The kids speak Hindi, French and English, and without contradictions. And I think the tension has always been there in me. I think as an artist, there is a fundamental tension of always being on the outside of something, looking in, and that allows you to then walk around it and question it. And the minute you're in it, you're in it. The minute you're not, that's a different space. And I like the contradiction of those spaces. But in the same way that, there's methods and materials of a traditional way of working, and yet they is not traditional. It's another layer of contradiction. And I think the modern dichotomy is that, where we're constantly trying to define ourselves, because somebody else is trying to define who we are for us. And I think that's a space I'm kind of interested in.
Yeah. I think there is a kind of very strong sense of that interest in kind of modernity as it was seen in the visual arts, as well as moving away from it or tweaking it to a more traditional way of looking at things, which is relating with the heart and the memory, etc., etc. We know those two movements as they happen in modernism. So I'm thinking of the sofa, the blue sofa, and Chris Klein, so you can't see that blue without thinking about Chris Klein. So it's kind of right there, dovetail, so, and the towel, the fabric that is draped on the back of the sofa is just straight out of, Berlin's painting.
I think I've always been interested. Yeah. But it's not that there's a real conscious effort to do this in order to arrive at that. I think all you can do as a painter is that you work with your materials, and they open doors for you. And then you walk through that door, and then suddenly you realize that there's a relationship between blue, which is Krishna, and blue, which is Klein, and there's blue, which is the Virgin Mary, and there's gold, which is the Virgin Mary, and there's Japanese painting, and it goes on like that. And suddenly, there's a whole raft of connections that you're not really aware of, and stories within stories within stories. And you constantly play with it, and kind of interested in it.
I think the other thing that has been kind of in my mind ever since I've seen your work is the whole idea of portraiture. And what you said earlier there, you want to see this great-grandfather. If you have to paint a great-grandfather and you don't know what it will look like and then a photograph to go by, you then construct, you build up, you imagine, and create a portrait of your great-grandfather. Now, that brings me to the idea of portraits and portraiture and what they actually, because it's such a huge genre in art, Western and Oriental, etc. You have it in miniature painting, of course. The idea of portraiture and miniature painting is so different from portraiture in European I'm interested in this that you're working within the miniature methods and bringing in very photographic work behind you there. Photographic elements into portrait, make the portrait. How does that work? How do you make it work?
I think I'm a frustrated portrait painter at the end of the day, like that. I constantly struggle with it. This idea of how you arrive at specificness, and it's there, and as soon as you get to there, it's somewhere else. And I'm interested in that sort of chase, and I think portraiture, when it's done well, kind of does that. One of my favourite painters is a man called Frank Albert, who's a London-based painter, who's one of the kitchen sink painters, where he paints these incredible, they're lashings of thick oil paint, where he destroys the faces completely in the moment and action of painting. And I love that as an idea, because he's constantly struggled to get to the point of it. If you ever see a film that was made by Jacob and his son, it's an amazing film. And beautiful, it's called Portrait of Frank Albert. So he sits there at the kitchen table, and he sits there and he's at the camera, and he says, I know I've decided to do this one, but I can't do it. I'm sorry, Jack, I just can't do it. I just don't feel as though you can come anywhere near my studio. I don't know what he said. So then his son's going to make a film about his father being an artist. And he can't make it because his dad doesn't want to be in the film. So what he does is then he makes a film about the people who have sat for Frank over the last 20 years. And what he does is he has 5 people throughout his life, and everyone has a different day: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And they count for 4 hours a day. And when he decides to do a portrait with you, you have to commit 15 years of your life to come at 4 o'clock every single day. That's the deal. And so it's completely nuts. And these are ordinary people. One of them's a gallerist, another one's she works for the welfare office. These are normal people who he just somehow gets people to do this thing. So the film's about these people talking about their experience of sitting for this guy for 20 years. And it's fascinating because they say he's the most interesting man in the world. And yet he never goes out. His life is the conversations that he has with the people who are leading lives. And then one day they come to him. And his life is led through their life. But he's capturing their life in this work. And it's this incredible relation between Situate painter and artist, between inward and outward, between his interior life as a maker and these outward beings that lead his life for him. If you ever get a chance, there's one part where it's his son, one of the people in it, and he says, you can go, Frank can go for painting for years, and then one day you just feel that he's about to finish it. And he says, I sit there and I try to be as much of me as I can be. I really have to concentrate on being me in order for him to cross the finish line. And he describes this incredible sort of energy between these two individuals that's been building up for years. And then finally, because they both want to get to it, the climax of it, but at the same time they don't, because the relationship stops. And Frank might not do another portrait of them, and then this person will walk with you for Wednesday afternoon for the next 10 years. It's all gone. But he describes this moment of, and I love the idea of that, the idea of a portrait being an abstraction, which is the decimation of something, but also the very specificity of what that thing is. And the idea of taking a Polaroid from a film, from a camera, from an image, and turning it into a painting. I want to play with that journey. I'm interested in how, because I think fundamentally that's what painting does. It takes what is kind of abstract and turns it into a different kind of reality, which may look abstract itself, and I like that. I'm kind of interested in that as a maker. If you ever see the film, it's fantastic. It's really, really an amazing portrait of the man.
That's a portrait right there, I don't portray of your mother speaking.
And isn't she a
That's
star?
amazing portrait.
Well, that's funny because I just said to her, do you mind if we do this? And I got a little camera with me. And then it was literally 10 minutes. We did 2 takes, one in the living room, one in my dad's office. And then I came back to India with it, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is really profound what she's saying. What was it like going to England? What did it feel like? What was that choice? We just had to go. That's it. she doesn't give anything else. It's kind of, it's deadpan, it's straightforward, and yet within those very simple words, and the way she looks at you, the way that she is, it's a portrait of a woman who, this is her life experience. And I found that just in very simple words, she says so much about the history of immigration, what it is for people who today are still dealing with it. They have to leave Syria, North Africa, Bangladesh, wherever, because they don't have a choice. And they come from the villages and they live in Mumbai. This is migration. It's the same thing going on, which is this will to do something else. And yet it's done in a very deadpan, straightforward, ordinary, matter-of-fact way, which is basically the woman. Absolutely.
And I guess typical of struggles. I mean, the romanticization of the struggle only happens after. It doesn't happen by the people who are going through it. I mean, you ask anyone coming out of Syria.
Exactly.
They're not going to romanticize anything.
Yeah. And this whole idea that how do we document history? Because it's an afterthought. And so the history just follows. The story is always told by the one who wins, not the opposite. And I find that really interesting. As a portrait. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah,
Just please.
One of those things you've done about the ship coming in, and that was in 1960, passing through the Suez.
Yeah.
I was on a boat coming from Marseille to Bombay.
So you came the opposite?
1960.
There was somebody who was here earlier on, a lady who said that she escaped from Nazi Germany.
And that's like the Algerian war and
Who's that? Yeah. I just think we all have these stories.
so the ships were all delayed because there was a war in Algiers.
Yeah.
So we were stuck in Paris. It's lovely how he's taken that story, and I'm a printer, I'm a designer. I see all your work and you combine so many things and brought it out so beautifully.
Thank you.
When you were putting this whole exhibition together, I mean, you also must have undergone a lot of discovery. I mean, it's like a discovery also, right? I mean, you were also, or did you let go everything?
No, I think it's therapy.
Sorry?
I think it's therapy.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my wife and I have this thing every year because we have 3 children. And I'm always busy with work, and so is she. So we go away in summer, and in summer I'm not allowed to work. So I have to be there. But I found that last summer I was in France, and I kept getting up early in the morning and writing this story, which is all the text that you see here. And I just kept writing and writing and writing because this story just literally was coming and I keep writing it there, which became the basis of the show. And my wife said, basically, this is like your own therapy. This is not art. This is you just dealing with your past. It is, actually. Yeah, it is, sure.
Is that painted? The,
Yeah.
The half tone?
Yeah. It's all painted. Yeah.
It looks almost like prints.
It's taken from a very old photograph that my mom gave me.
Like the technique they're using in America, where they take a painting on the computer, they can transfer it onto canvas. I've done that.
You know, I actually printed some stuff on canvas. I thought, why not just save some time and stick it on the word?
But that's mechanical.
But I actually did try it, and then I sat with it and thought, I've got to paint it. Somehow
No,
I have
it's
to paint it.
beautiful. You combine it so well.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, let's have a drink.
Since you work with traditions as contemporary art, I mean, would you call this a contemporary miniature? I mean, is that even possible, or is it still a traditional, miniature painting in a contemporary age?
I'd say the audience is out on that one. I think you have to make a decision with that one. thanks for coming and for attending the show. If you get a chance to see the film, do. And perhaps come back and have a look without the crowd and about 5 minutes of people waffling on. But thank you. Thanks to Rasna.
Thank you, Desmond. Thank you, Rasna, for this very interesting walkthrough and this engaging conversation. Thank you. I think we've had a wonderful evening. Thank you, audience, for being here. I hope we've had a great evening. And thank you, Chemould, for having us here. It's great to be doing this event. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening.